This video is part 5 of Chapter 8, Personality Theories, for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. In this part of the chapter, we'll start off by talking about what's called the person-situation controversy, and then we'll move on to talking about assessment techniques. It's important to, before we launch into looking at measurement, that we acknowledge that who you are as a person interacts with the situation you're in. Sometimes who you are is the dominant predictor of how you will behave. Sometimes the situation you're in is the dominant predictor of how you will behave. That leads to what's called the person-situation controversy. Do traits or situations best predict behavior is one way of putting it. Now, the psychologist Walter Mischel argued that, because he was a behavioral psychologist primarily, although on the social side of that, he argued that situations were the bigger driver, much bigger than inborn personality traits in determining behavior. He argued, he was sort of a foundational social psychologist. He believed that situations had a tremendous amount of impact and control over how we would respond emotionally, and how we would think about situations and how we would think about ourselves in those situations. He argued that research had shown that correlation between your assessed traits, when you look at measures like the Big Five, they were actually pretty weak in being able to predict how people would behave across a variety of laboratory-based situations. So his argument, Mischel's argument, was that behavior is highly situationally dependent. You can set up social situations where people will behave completely the opposite of what their trait profiles look like. And that goes against the argument that traits are strong predictors of behavior. Epstein argued that if you do assessment of personality carefully and you include a person's behavior over time, not just single situations. So, the Walter Mischel approach says, I can construct a situation and you will behave in response to that situation in a way that has nothing to do with your underlying traits. He's right. Epstein's argument is, okay, if you really want to understand the impact of traits, you have to measure behavior across situations over time. And if you do that, the impact of traits tends to become larger over time. So yes, there are situations that are so strong that they will override your basic trait profile. On the other hand, Epstein's approach is valid in that research has shown that traits, especially when they're measured carefully using valid techniques, are good baseline predictors of people's behaviors across time and across situations. There may or may not be good predictors in any one situation, but over time, they will tend to be good predictors. So let's talk about how assessment is done. Personality tests are only as good as how they're structured and how they're used. Typically, personality tests like the McRae and Costa model, the Big Five, or the ISync model, or any of 100 other models, they're useful only in the domain for which they were intended. Now, they can be used to be diagnostic. There are measures that are used for diagnosing personality disorders and other things. So they may be useful in counseling. They may be useful in other kinds of contexts, like deciding your career path or making personnel decisions. Usually when there are problems, it's because the assessment method, the test, is inappropriate to the situation where it's being used. There are lots of different kinds of personality tests. Your authors focus on a couple broad categories, and these would be so-called personality inventories, which you're probably the most familiar with, things like the MMPI or the Ocean, the Big Five measure. And then there's a whole broad category called projective tests, which aren't used as often today as they were in the past. There are lots of other types of personality tests, but they aren't used as often. So when we look at these inventories and projective tests, we're only just going to barely scratch the surface. You will probably have more familiarity with the inventories than with the projective tests in terms of your actual exposure to them. So inventories are designed typically to measure many different traits. Usually they're on dimensions. Sometimes they're used to be diagnostic of specific disorders. So they typically have a series of questions. Sometimes the person taking the test will do it on a computer or do paper and pencil. Sometimes an interviewer will ask questions and elicit answers. Regardless, the person is going to respond to questions or statements, and they're going to indicate whether or not they apply. The assumption is that the person can accurately report on their own personality traits. These tests are usually going to involve specific kinds of actions, attitudes, beliefs, interests, values, etc. Your authors describe as an example of a personality inventory the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. It's gone through several iterations. The MMPI-2 questions are answered in a true-false way, true-false or cannot say format. It's a long test. It has a lot of questions. It takes about between an hour and a half to complete. It has, all kinds of questions that can then be used to characterize personality. The MMPI was originally developed to assess 10 basic areas of abnormal personality traits. So it was designed to be of clinical utility. It also includes, though, some items that are helpful for identifying patterns of responses that are connected to those 10 different disorders. So there are some patterns of responses that are indicative of depression, some that are indicative of schizophrenia, others for anxiety, and so on. The MMPI now is not hand scored, it's computer scored, and it's going to generate a profile of attributes that people have. Now again, the original intent of the MMPI was basically to screen people for vulnerability to certain kinds of disorders. It was not intended originally to help make employment decisions or to put people in the right careers. It has been, on occasion, inappropriately used for that. So its most intended use is for identifying patterns of traits that may be associated with certain kinds of abnormal patterns of behavior. It also includes items, part of the reason it's so long is it has lots of duplicate items because they want to know that people are being consistent in the way that they're responding. It also includes items that are used to identify whether a person is trying to fake their symptoms. So, for instance, if a person has committed a crime and they want to, launch an insanity defense, they may want to act, quote unquote, a little crazy on their assessment. So they may be selecting responses that indicate schizophrenia or indicate other patterns of behaviors that might explain why they committed a crime. So just talking off the top of my head, what you're looking at there is a subscale on the MMPI that's designed to detect people who are lying. And evidence suggests that it's pretty useful for doing so. So the MMPI is just one example. There are hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of personality inventories. They all have a bit of a different purpose, depending on the context for which they're used. The MMPI is typically used in clinical settings. Now, projective tests are older. They historically were more commonly used. They're not used as often today. When they're used today, it's usually to try and encourage people to open up, to kind of dig around in their creative expressions in order to tap into unconscious or subconscious ideas. As you could guess, these were tests that were that originated in the context of psychoanalytic theory or psychodynamic theory, because the assumption is that if we can present people with ambiguous stimuli, we should be able to unlock some of their hidden thoughts. Now, in later use, though, what projective tests were used to do is to give people, a bunch of these ambiguous stimuli, and then look for patterns in people's responding. The assumption was that the patterns of their responding, like, are people interpreting the pictures that they see with themes that suggest paranoia, or themes that suggest depression, or themes that suggest optimism? That could be characteristic of who that person is and how they interpret the world. These tests, when they're administered, you're not giving people objective responses, so it's not true, false, it's not yes or no. They have to give a verbal response, a description. So the assumption is that people are going to respond to these ambiguous stimuli such that it will bring to the surface their personality traits. One example of a projective test is the inkblot test. What it involves, and there are lots of protocols for using these inkblots. It includes these symmetrical inkblots, and the test taker is to tell the test giver what they see in the picture. Now, the pictures are intentionally ambiguous. To me, it looks like, okay, this could be a sci-fi monster. Now, if I saw sci-fi type monsters in every single inkblot, that might say something about my personal conflicts, my inner dynamics. The inkblot test was originally developed to be consistent with psychodynamic theory. Now, it's the approach, the whole projective test approach has been controversial, primarily because it's very difficult to validate from one test giver to the next exactly what kind of interpretations you're making. So the Rorschach test has gone through many, many iterations. It's not so much that the test has changed. The blots are still the blots. It's the scoring system. So today, there is a Rorschach scoring system that people have to go through training to learn how to apply. And it has been published, and it can be used for kind of describing who people are, but also in a clinical setting for getting people to open up and to talk about themes that emerge in their thinking about their world. Similarly, the thematic apperception test involves pictures. There, in the original card deck, you had 31 cards with black and white pictures, and they're open to interpretation. Like, you could look at this picture and say, here's a person trapped in an airport, and they're so tired, they've just put their head down and they're sleeping. Or, this person has just been broken up with by her fiancé, and she is devastated. Whichever. So the test taker, is asked to make up a story that suggests a context for what's happening in the picture. And the test giver is going to, after looking at all of these stories, they're going to look for themes. Scoring of the TAT is tricky. It's really open to the interpretation of the test giver. Where these kinds of tests are most useful is, say, in a counseling or clinical setting. If you want to just open people up to the kinds of themes that their thinking is reflecting, it can become a way of exploring those ideas. It shouldn't be used because it hasn't been demonstrated to be valid and reliable. It shouldn't be used for diagnostic purposes because it just doesn't have the research to back it up. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 8.